My name is Andrew Delton. I've been working on a paper called Partisan Goals and Political Mobilization with my colleagues Theresa Robertson and Petersen. So our starting point is a classic puzzle in political science, which is why vote. Voting has real costs in time and energy. This is a picture, it's hard to tell in a picture, but this is a scene from the desert of Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, people in line to go vote. So it's extremely hot, so they're really paying a cost here to go cast their ballots. But of course, as we all know, when it comes to national and state elections, and all but generally speaking, your vote is never going to be decisive. So from an instrumental perspective, voting is never rational, at least in these large elections. Now, a recent possible solution to this that many people have been looking at is the idea of social pressure. So social approval or disapproval might motivate voting. So if someone says it's a bad thing to do, not to vote, then that might cause you to vote. But and one example of this is a recent Nature paper by Bond and colleagues showing that publicizing whether your friends are voting on Facebook leads people to vote themselves, presumably because they would feel a little ashamed if everyone else they knew was voting, but they weren't themselves. Okay, so social pressure is an interesting idea of a way to solve this problem that can potentially explain why people vote, but it immediately creates a new puzzle, which is, well, why should we be putting social pressure on others? If you know the social pressure literature, usually it's researchers who are doing the manipulation of adding some sort of social pressure to the situation, but in the real world, presumably it's actual citizens who are doing this. So why should they engage in social pressure? If you were a citizen like Sean P. Diddy Combs, now it actually can make sense to engage in social pressure because you're so famous, so many people know you, that you can actually effectively mobilize a reasonable chunk of the electorate, as he attempted to do with his very strange vote or die campaign. I don't actually know whether vote or die was intended as a threat or just as a prediction. I'm not really sure. But if we're not, none of us in this room and most citizens aren't P. Diddy, so for us, there's real cost, again, to putting pressure on other people, but still uncertain benefits. Maybe they will vote, maybe they won't. Maybe they'll vote for the wrong guy, the wrong candidate. So our goal with this paper is to study some possible triggers that lead people to engage in social pressure. Now, one possibility is that we have a norm of a civic duty to vote. So it's our civic duty to go to the ballots. If this is true, then people should pressure everyone, regardless of partisanship, to vote. After all, the national duty, everyone who's a citizen of our nation should be going out there to cast a ballot. Now, we take a little bit of a different perspective. We think largely social pressure is being used to advance partisan goals, not to advance a civic duty, a national duty. So the theory we work with starts with the idea that partisan groups are just one subset of all the enduring coalitions that people belong to. So to understand this, we draw on the psychology of coalitions and mindsets. So coalitions are a very long-standing feature of human evolutionary history. We've been engaging in groups but far longer than there's been modern nation states and modern elections. And what psychologists have discovered is that there's a rich psychology that underpins coalitional action. And this psychology, when it's activated, it changes how we act and how we perceive the world. And so we use the term coalitional mindsets to refer to the chronic or the temporary activation of this piece of our evolved coalitional and political psychology. So to study this idea, we wanted to examine coalitional mindsets in two contexts. First, we wanted to examine chronic activation of coalitional mindsets using a population-based survey in the US, comparing people who are party members, who presumably have this mindset chronically activated, with people who are independents. But that was an observational study, and we wanted to pin down causality by using an experimental method. And here we turn to a very different institutional environment, Denmark, and used a student sample where we could experimentally manipulate their mindsets. So on a coalitional mindset view, a partisan goals view, who should be pressured with social pressure? Well, on this view, when a coalitional mindset has been activated, people with that mindset activated should be especially putting pressure on their co-partisans. It shouldn't be just more generally on people within the nation. So this is the who should be pressured. And we also wanted to examine how should this pressure be applied. So our idea is that this is part of our evolved psychology for managing political group relationships. So it should use evolved tools. And one evolved tool is the expression of emotion. So we think anger is going to be used to cause non-voters to vote, and gratitude will be used to reinforce voting for people who are currently voting. So in our first study, in the US, we compared partisans and independents. Now, regardless of whether you were a partisan, you were asked to imagine being part of a cooperative group, working together to get your favorite candidate elected. This was a population-based survey run through time-sharing experiments and using knowledge networks before they became GFK. So in this study, you were asked to imagine that there's a current presidential election going on, and you and like-minded people were attempting to get your favorite candidate elected. The reason for this is because the current president does not share your views, so you want to make sure someone who does share your views takes office. Our dependent measures were two measures of how angry you are at a person who is not voting. This included both an in-group member and then also separately for an out-group member. In-group member here means someone who does share your views, out-group member, someone who does not. And we also asked similar questions about how grateful you would be towards someone who is voting. We had a number of control variables. In addition to standard demographics, we asked people how committed they were to their political values. We use this instead of standard measures of political identification because this can apply equally to people who are partisans and independents, whereas typical measures of identification are about how much you identify with a party. It obviously doesn't really work for independents. We also asked how much they expected to personally benefit if their candidate was elected and controlled for that. We asked a question about how often they contributed in the past. So this was a retrospective measure of their real life contributions. And finally, of course, ideology. So all these are controlled for in the analysis I'm going to present to you. Study 2, despite being on the same topic, differed in many details. Here, instead of observing differences between partisans and independents, we wanted to experimentally induce a coalitional mindset. So in this study, we had about 180 Danish students, so they're in a very different political environment, a parliamentary system rather than our presidential system. Now, in this study, everyone was a partisan because we wanted to manipulate whether or not their partisan mindset, a coalitional mindset, was active for these people. So we needed them all to be partisans to begin with. Scenario was very similar, except we transformed it to work in a parliamentary system. Dependent measures were identical. How angry you are at people who are not voting, how grateful you are at people who are voting. And the big difference, obviously, in this study is that we had an experimental induction designed to get people into either a coalitional mindset or a neutral mindset. Don't worry about reading all this, but in the neutral mindset, the idea is we want people to think of themselves not as a party member, but as a neutral, objective observer. So we wanted them to be as unbiased as possible, as neutral as possible, as they evaluate these people who were or who were not voting. In the coalitional mindset condition, we asked people to be very explicitly partisan in their judgments. So to really think of themselves in terms of their partisan membership, in terms of being a member of this political party. And this is based on similar techniques for engaging and activating mindsets in social psychology. Okay, so let's just see how anger is affected by mindsets in the target. So I'm going to start with the US sample. So what you can see is that when we consider the US sample, is there a... There is. Oh, great. Okay. So when we consider the US sample, so these are in-group members we're thinking about. The dark bar is party members who presumably have a chronic coalitional mindset active. And indeed, they are angrier than independents when considering in-group members who are not voting. But perhaps what's going on is maybe for whatever reason, party members are just generally more emotional or even just more angry than independents. So we want to check what they do when considering out-group members. And in fact, this pattern is eliminated and possibly a little reversed. When considering people who don't share their political views, party members are not any more likely, in fact, somewhat less likely, to try to motivate them to vote through anger. And of course, perhaps not surprisingly, whether you're a party member or an independent, you're more angry at people who are your own in-group who are not voting. So this is a sample collected in a population-based survey in the US. observational techniques in our presidential system. What happens when we change a lot of these factors? We move to an experiment, the Danish parliamentary system with a student sample. We get essentially the same results in this extremely different context. When considering in-group members, Danish students with a coalitional mindset are significantly more angry than people with a neutral mindset. Oh, I should have said our dependent variables were rescaled to move between 0 and 1. And of course, and again, as with the US sample, this effect is eliminated and slightly reversed when we move from in-group members to out-group members. So it's not that people with coalitional mindsets are just generally more emotional or more angry. It's specifically that they are targeting co-partisans to mobilize their efforts. So this emotion is anger. The idea is that anger should cause people who are currently not voting, not contributing, to then change their actions and then be a good contributor. Let's look at gratitude, which is about reinforcing pre-existing levels of cooperation. With gratitude, we see virtually the same pattern. And again, across both samples, despite the vast differences between the two. Oops. For in-group members, people with coalitional mindsets are more grateful than people without coalitional mindsets, whether we use party members versus independents or our experimental induction. Either way, we see the same difference in means. And like before, this difference is eliminated or even reversed if we move from in-group members to out-group members. So, based on our data, a lot of social pressure when actual normal citizens engage in it is not about upholding a civic duty to vote. It seems to be engaged for partisan goals. We find this in two very different contexts, a chronic context involving a population-based sample of Americans, and an experimental context with Danish students. And it seems to be expressed via at least two emotions, possibly more. The ones we examined were anger and gratitude. I want to thank you guys for coming to this early session on a Sunday. And remember, if you don't vote, Diddy's going to kill you. All right, thanks very much.